So first of all, I wanted to say congratulations on the film.
Thank you
It's
so much. It's
it's
exciting. It's release
it's
date
incredible.
today. It's the big.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Thank
And
you.
it must be really exciting because it's been, such a long time coming.
It has.
Um, Speaking of which, I did want to ask you what inspired you really in the first place to make this documentary?
I think I was really keen to make a really 3D portrait of motherhood, particularly of being a single mom, because I felt like, particularly in feature documentary, I hadn't really seen that. Seen it a bit more in drama, but not in documentary. And I suppose because I had such a sort of heartfelt lived experience of that. And I love autobiographical filmmaking. So as my own story, origin story of being a single parent began when I was 38. And after a very short relationship, found myself pregnant, single and broke. And I didn't decide to make a film about Jim almost as he came out of the womb. It was more like I had some DVCAM footage, which was sort of home movie footage. And it wasn't until he was about 11 or 12 when I got some short form commissions to tell the story of our family that I started to build the archive, the smartphone archive, because it's shot across five different generations of smartphones. So it's 80% smartphone footage. But yeah, I think in terms of what inspired me was to add a challenging portrait of parenthood. I think we often see a very filtered version of motherhood. Think about the TikToks where all of those super moms are doing like the packed lunch, these like ridiculously crazy packed lunch. Whereas the reality is that mothers are thinking, damn, I've run out of the bloody bread for the sandwich and the get setting out in the car and getting some from the garage at midnight. That's the reality of parenting composed to the sort of filtered, romanticized idea of parenting. And obviously, Motherboard is much more the reality, the brutal realism of raising kids, but also the joy of it. Because it's one of the, Jim is my best outcome. He's I'm incredibly proud of him. So, and I've loved it. I've really loved it. So I wanted to capture the joy of parenting, but also the difficult reality of it sometimes as well.
Yeah, and I think what really struck me about the film is that there's some really funny moments and then just obviously life, right? There's so many sad moments and very intimate as well for both
Yeah.
you and Jim. How
Yeah.
did you sort of balance the two and having both like a joyous portrayal of motherhood, but also being real and being true to what life is?
Well, I think we wanted that combination of not avoiding the really difficult emotional journeys that Jim and I have been on. For him meeting his dad, but also for both of us, the difficulty of when I got a breast cancer diagnosis out of the blue, and how I think more difficult that is when you're in a small family. Jim just has one parent. He's very close to my mum, but my mum's in her 80s. So as you know from the film, I wanted to give an authentic portrayal of that difficult stuff. So it is sometimes, I think, a very tough watch. But also, the one thing me and Jim really have in common, we're quite different in some respects, but we really have a shared sense of humor and a kind of gallows sense of humor. And he really helped me through the cancer with his kind of gallows sense of humor. And I think that like in great drama, you need you need major and minor notes,
Mhm.
it won't work if it's all one note. And so I hope that the humor and comedy, particularly in the last half an hour, tempers what a sort of quite exposing and difficult film it is. And it gave me huge duty of care issues for Jim because uh, from when he was 13 or 14, and you see that we also capture, like, we have a humdinger of a row in COVID. And I recorded that because I was doing an immersive sound piece and at the beginning of COVID. And I'm fascinated by how we use phones. And the way we went back to I went back to landline calls at the beginning of COVID. And because I couldn't see my mom. So I was ringing her on the landline for like 50 minutes every
Mhm.
day. And I recorded those calls, and they were just really quite funny about, she was trying to cope with all the food shortages and get tomato ketchup for Jim and toilet roll when everybody ran out of toilet roll. But that's why I ended up recording. The phone was being recorded when we had this humdinger of a row at the beginning of COVID, where I'd suggested to Jim that he do his driving test theory test as a productive thing to be doing in COVID, which I look back on now and think, what a crazy idea. And it was one of those things where a little thing explodes into a really big row. And I said, some terrible things. And then you hear me obviously full of regret and sort of, angst ridden talking to my mom. And then he rings and finds I'm talking to her and says, shut up, shut up, shut up. And I think we had 3 years. Jim has always had power of veto with the film. And we had 3 years of him watching assemblies and rough cuts and deciding what was going to be in and what wasn't. And so that was a really good amount of time to think, do we use that? And he was worried that people might not like him and that would be judgmental about him. And at one point, we had a test screening. We were funded by Oka, who come out of the Wellcome Trust. And we had a test screening with them, which was really useful because Jim was convinced that everybody would think he was terrible. And of course, the love in the room was really evident for him because we've either been that teenager or been that parent or both. And I think in the film as well, you see the arc for Jim of what a terrible lot of things he's had to handle to get him to that point. We were just coming out of my breast cancer recovery, and then stage left came COVID, and then there's more health anxieties, not only for me, but for my mom. Obviously, she was in her 80s. And the irony is I've never had COVID. So I think about all the stress at the beginning, and I don't think I've ever had it, amazingly. I'm probably one of the few people around that didn't, that lucky was enough to escape it.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I did want to ask you like how much Jim was involved in the final product, and
A
it's really
lot.
interesting to me that he had so much like veto power as well.
Yeah, he has a kind of creative consultant credit because I think
Hmm.
definitely saw him not just as subject, but as kind of collaborator and co-creator because he was involved so much in watching cuts and deciding what we should work with and what he wasn't happy with if he wasn't. And then you also see in the film, he was amazing in that he gave me some of his phone footage. And it's really important because, of course, he has a life outside of me in the flat, and that's where you see his friendships and him at festivals and at college and drinking too much on nights out. And, again, I wanted not only a 3D portrait of a mother going from 38 to 60, but I wanted a 3D portrait of a child growing up, including the teen years when they become, it's a rites of passage and they become an adult and they go through all of
Hmm.
those big life journeys, hard ones.
Yeah.
Like, how do you learn to pull back on the drinking and the partying? And, you know,
Hmm.
I think that I've been watching a lot of the Osbournes recently since Ozzy died. And actually, because somebody was asking me the other day, what is there other things out there that are like this? And I don't think there's a lot. There's the Seven Up series that Michael Apted did. But actually, I remembered how much I loved the Osbournes when it first came out. And I think it's because there is something similar about wanting to show the teen years in all of their
Yeah.
unfiltered glory. And
Yeah.
that there's real love in that family. I went right the way through 4 seasons and got to the final
Hmm.
episode where they're interviewed by Dr. Phil from the Oprah show. Do you remember, the tall guy who was the therapist
Yeah.
on Winfrey? And he starts off by saying, "You're the most dysfunctional family in America. You swear all the time. You've moved 27 times in 20 years. You're a terrible role model for your kids in terms of drugs and partying." But then he ends up going, "But I think you're the most loving family in America. And I can see how much you love one another. And that's completely evident." And I think I found that quite relatable. I mean, obviously, I'm not quite Ozzy Osbourne and Jim's not quite the Osbourne kids. He's not had to do rehab, but I knew what he meant. I thought it was a really funny
Yeah.
transition to go from you're the most dysfunctional family in America to actually you're the most loving, and you're the greatest
Yeah.
example with love in a family, you know.
Yeah. And like you said, the film comes out today in the UK, which is
Yes.
fantastic.
Yeah.
How has the initial reaction to the film been so far from test screenings? And I know it's been to festivals as well.
Really good. All of our kind of mainstream press has been lovely. And it's nice to see the sort of reoccurring things that come up. You know, people often talk about
Hmm.
Richard Linklater's Boyhood, which obviously was a big inspiration for me. People often say that it's like a love letter for Jim, and I think yes, I think it is. Lots of critics are picking up on the feminism of it. Lots of female critics to really identify with, I think the issue of how do women have kids and not pay the motherhood penalty in terms of their career. And also, I think some of the rather sexist ideas that we have about single moms, that we almost reserve more shame for the women that stayed than the men that leave. And there's been a few women critics that have sort of picked up on that. So that's been nice. Um, yeah, so like really fantastic press. It's been wonderful to see, really. It's been great.
I did want to ask about the sort of feminist element because obviously you had to change careers when Jim was born.
Mm.
Was it ever your intention to sort of comment on how precarious the film industry is, especially for women, or was it sort of just like natural to include in the film?
No, I think you see it in two sequences. So that bit at the beginning where I'm giving a bit of backstory and I say, the industry doesn't give a damn about single parents, because certainly in 2004 that was true. I think it's probably fairly true today, but it was, at that time there was no flexi time, there were no organizations like at the moment, there's now organizations like raising films, which are set up to sort of help parents in the screen industry balance the sort of challenges of bringing up kids, but also trying to keep a foothold in the screen industries. So there's that element where you sort of hear about that, and then I think you see. I think there's that kind of reflexive storyline where you see that I'm also trying to raise funding for the film. And I'm
Hmm.
sort of fond of the Venice sequence, which where I'm away for work pitching Motherboard, and Jim was 17 at the time, and the idea was that my mum just lives around the corner, was that he was going to go and stay with her and maybe have a night on his own. And of course it just went off the rails. And he partied too hard, as you see in that sequence. And he was in such a bad way. And he was phoning me all the time. And when he finally told me what was really going on, but I couldn't be physically with him. And I think it was like the first time that I couldn't be physically there. My mum was there for him, and that she really saved the day in the end. Uh, but in a way, I wanted to leave that in as an example of I was away doing something important for me, but I was also feeling the guilt that I wasn't 100% there. I was trying to still parent him, but from a distance. And I did feel guilty, and I think you get a bit of that, but then you also see the way with Jim. I love that he leaves me that voicemail and he goes, he's asked for help from other people, and that to me is a big part of growing up, is finding your other family that you choose. And Jim's always had really close friendships who are incredibly supportive, and he's really supportive of them. And I love that voicemail when he's going, Grandma saved me, my friend saved me, your calls to help me. It's really moving. So yes, I do think it's a theme I wanted to explore in Motherboard.
Hmm. Yeah, of course. And obviously, this is very autobiographical. What is the biggest challenge or some of the challenges that you found in making something that is so personal to you?
Um, I found it hard because I co-edited it and it was a long edit. We were with 2 years of editing it full time. And I found it really difficult when I had, it's 8 years now since I was first diagnosed with cancer. And you can imagine the footage I'm looking at on a daily basis when I've sort of recovered. I mean, obviously, you're always a bit nervous about what might come in the future, but my hair had grown back and I felt like, I'd felt healthy again. But I'm looking at footage of me in the thick of the worst of the cancer treatment when I'm suffering a chemically induced menopause and I've lost my hair, and you age like a decade sort of overnight. And you see that I don't want to be vain in Motherboard either. I wanted to sort of show a woman's journey growing, went from 38 to 60, but particularly when a kind of really big chronic illness hits and what that looks like. And I remember saying, had really good therapist, and I remember saying, maybe it's not good for me, like looking at the cancer footage every day. And she said, well, it depends whether you're just reliving it or re-scripting it. And I think that autobiographical storytelling is the re-scripting, because you have in something like cancer, you have no sense of control and no agency. But actually how you tell that story and how you represent that story, you do have some control over, and that does make you feel better. And so in the end, I decided that, and that's what I was able to keep going. But, when I'm watching, you can imagine how many times I've seen the film now with the festival run and when we're doing preview screenings and Q&As. And the bit sometimes that I nip out to go to the loo is the Christmas period, the Christmas sequence, when I'm been through all the treatment and then I've started to obsess that what happens if it comes back, and Jim's still so young, and I get really upset. And then I don't think it's my finest hour in terms of parenting when I'm sort of berating him for being monosyllabic. He's 14 and he can't help me. So that is the sequence I find really hard. And I was persuaded to keep it in because one of the consultant editors said to me, because I said, oh, I think I look like a terrible parent when I'm giving him grief, because I'm never quite sure if he's tearing up, and I've sort of missed it. And I think he is, and I have. And the consultant editor, this lovely guy called Isidore Bethel, said, I think what it captures is that you're both really suffering, but for the first time, you can't help one another. So you're just really lonely in separate rooms, suffering in different ways. And even though you really love one another, you can't help one another at that moment. And I thought, well, if that's what it comes across, that was spot on to what that time was like. So yeah, that's the bit I find the hardest, but it was also, I think, incredibly helpful to me. And I know Jim probably finds hard when we're watching, because again, he does the Q&As with me and watches it again. And yeah, I think he probably finds it hard to watch again when he's shouting at his mother when he's 16 years old. And so for both of us, it's quite exposing, but I think both of us also believe that it captures something about being human, because we're all flawed and we all lose it and we all implode and we all have great moments and terrible moments. So, I think it's important to be that real, really.
Yeah, of course. And I also did want to ask you if you had any inspirations in terms of documentary filmmaking or filmmaking in general when making this film.
There's a feature documentary called Stories We Tell that was made by Sarah Polley, and it's about her discovery in late life that the man who she thought was her biological father wasn't, and that her mother had had an affair, and that in fact she has a different biological father, and that the whole family knew except her. And it's a brilliant film of her going back to that and telling the story. And I think it was a real inspiration, because Sarah Polley was a child actress initially, and she's also a kind of drama director. And for me, it was an example of autobiographical storytelling doesn't work if you just offload. It's not, by virtue of it being emotional and exposing doesn't make it good. I think Baby Reindeer is probably an example of that. But when you have a director's hat on and you're a skilled storyteller and you can have that distance, that emotional distance, and Sarah Polley really does. And Michaela Cole's I May Destroy You is another great example of that, telling a story about something that's really difficult, lived experience of rape or sexual assault, but with a director's hat on. And it's quite difficult to explain, but I think it's that sort of intellectual distance on emotional, visceral experience. And so Sarah Polley had it, Michaela Cole had it, Richard Gadd did not have it in Baby Reindeer, which is one of the reasons I never liked that thing. So I think, yeah, I think that's important. And the other great influence for me was Pamela Adlon, who made a series called Better Things. That was about her raising, she's a single mum, and it was about her raising her three daughters, teenage daughters in LA. And it's a drama, but it's completely autobiographically written. And it was the first time, like, really, I would love to meet her and tell her what an influence it was, because it was the first time I saw a representation of a single mom who was cool and sexy and funny and flawed at times, but just so funny, you know. So that was a big influence on wanting the kind of somehow the cool factor. I think Jim provides it. I don't think I'm ever cool, but Jim is, in particularly in his late teen years. So yeah, that was a big influence, but not so much documentaries. I think documentaries almost is like a slightly more traditional genre, and we had real problems getting it financed. And we had a very funny meeting after I'd won a BAFTA for one of the shorts. It got us a meeting with Netflix, but the commissioner came on straight away and said, actually, it's a no. I just thought I'd come on and tell you it's a no. And it's a no because your filmmaking is really small and personal. And what we're after at Netflix is big, epic stories about true crime and space. And I thought, I've got nothing to lose here because it's a no. So I just, you know what? Raising a kid entirely on your own, and then that child's meeting their father for the first time at 13, closely followed by my breast cancer. And then Jim's difficult teen years. That's put us on a really epic journey. And I think in documentary, there is this sense of there just not being enough exploration of women's stories, how women navigate the world in terms of friendships, relationships, dating, parenting, and that would be dismissed by a lot of male commissioners as being small, personal, whereas in fact it's epic. And there's a
Yeah.
really comic writer called Jessie Klein, and she takes, the kind of hero's journey model that Joseph Campbell first put out with, so much of filmmaking and literature and plays are about the hero's journey, usually male, usually the man leaving to go out into the world and meeting the hurdles externally. And Jessie Klein says motherhood is a hero's journey, but instead of it being a journey to far-flung spaces and places, it's a journey inwards and downwards to the deepest parts of you that you didn't even know existed. And I think it's so true. And I do think motherhood is a hero's journey. So I kind of hope that Motherboard captures that in some way.